He was the Brown Bomber, a symbol of strength, a symbol of pride, of unity during a divided time in America. And in the late 1940s, he found peace, not in a ring and not in a stadium, but here in Pompton Lakes, New Jersey. Welcome to Something Happens Here. I'm your host, Paul Bastante, and today we're telling the story of one of the greatest athletes in American history and his surprising connection to this quiet little corner of Passaic County, New Jersey. This is the story of Joe Louis and his time in Pompton Lakes. Before he was a neighbor in North Jersey, Joe Louis was the heavyweight champion of the world. His reign from 1937 to 1949 remains one of the longest in boxing history. He fought racism, fascism, and the odds as well, becoming a national hero in a segregated country. By the 1940s, Louis wasn't just a boxer. He was a unifying force in a divided America. Black and white Americans tuned in to hear his fights over the radio. His victory over Max Schmeling wasn't just a win in the ring, it was a symbolic blow against Nazi propaganda. After his peak years, Louis was looking for more than titles. He wanted peace, community, and a place to just breathe. And that's how he found his way to Pompton Lakes, New Jersey. Joe Louis lived here in a beautiful home on Riverdale Road near the Wanacue River. In fact, many longtime locals remember seeing him around town. He wasn't hidden away. He was present. He was a resident, a unique part of the Pompton Lakes neighborhood. He boarded horses. He held barbecues. His property became something of a local legend, and kids in town would talk about, quote, Joe Louis lives here, end quote. It was surreal. A world champion in a small New Jersey town. Joe Louis's time in Pompton Lakes mattered, not just because he was famous, but because he chose here. At a time when racial divides were real, even in the North, Louis found community in a town that welcomed him with open arms. His presence also reminded people that greatness doesn't always live in the spotlight. Sometimes it lives right down the street. And now, decades later, many here don't even know that he was here. But the streets remember, the land remembers, and of course, that's why we tell these stories, because something happened here.
Gave him another left to the body, a hard left. He's got there in my corner, right above me. He gave him a left to the face. He brought in a right uppercut, a right to the head, a right to the head, another right to the head. There is covering up in the corner, not making a return.
Human beings have engaged in hand-to-hand combat since the earliest days of mankind. And while the origins of the sport of boxing remain unclear, some sources suggest that its prehistoric roots date back to what is modern-day Ethiopia, emerging as early as the 6th millennium BC.
The earliest evidence for rules in the sport of boxing date all the way back to ancient Greece, where it was established as an Olympic sport in 688 BC.
But it wasn't until almost 1,000 years later that boxing evolved to include prize fights in the 17th and 18th century to the forerunner of the popular game that we see today all over the world.
But the sport's first ever match is said to date all the way back to January 6, 1681, in Great Britain under very unusual circumstances.
The first recorded boxing match took place in Britain when Christopher Monk, the second Duke of Albemarle, engineered a bout between his butler and his butcher, with the winner earning a prize.
The nature of the prize is not known to history, but his butcher was apparently victorious. First boxing rules, called the Broughton Rules, were introduced by champion Jack Broughton in 1743 to protect fighters in the ring where deaths occurred much too frequently. Under these rules, if a man went down and could not continue after a count of 30 seconds, the fight was over. Hitting a downed fighter and grasping below the waist were prohibited.
These rules allowed the fighters an advantage not enjoyed by today's boxers because they permitted the fighters to drop to one knee to end the round and begin the 30-second count at any time.
Thus, a fighter realizing he was in trouble would have an opportunity to recover before being knocked out. This, however, was considered unsportsmanlike or even unmanly. Boxing in the early days was becoming very popular as a sport, but it was also becoming a way for everyday citizens to settle disputes, even between women.
In 1790 in Waddington, Lincolnshire, Mary Farmery and Susanna Locker both laid claims to the affections of the same young man.
This produced a challenge to fight each other for the prize, which was accepted by the latter.
Cornermen were chosen on both sides and the fight was on. After several knockdown blows on both sides, the fight ended in a victory for Mary Farmery, who won the match and the man.
You have to remember, at this point in time, we didn't have the sports that we have today. There was nothing, only boxing.
As humans moved into the more modern era of the sport, and as other sports rose to prominence in the 1900s, boxing remained as popular as ever. But it wasn't until the early 1930s that the sport really turned the corner. And it took the arrival of the Brown Bomber to catapult the sport to new levels. Joseph Louis Barrow was an American professional boxer who competed from 1934 until 1951 and is widely regarded as one of the most influential and best boxers of all time.
Joe Louis reigned as the world heavyweight champion from 1937 to 1949. 11 years, 8 months, and 8 days to be exact, and that is a record in boxing that stands to this day.
And as much success as Louis had in the ring during his great career, he perhaps had just as tough a time out of the ring as an African-American man in a sport not really ready for a black champion at the time.
May 13, 1914, Joseph Louis Barrow is born in Lafayette, Alabama. He was the seventh of 8 children and a grandson of slaves. His father was a sharecropper and his mother was a laundress. At the age of 3 years old, his family moved to Detroit, Michigan, where Louis later discovered his love of boxing.
His father was committed to an asylum when he was just 2 years old. His mother remarried and moved the family soon after to Detroit, and it wasn't much time later that Joe was introduced to the sport that would become his lifelong pursuit. Joe's mother, however, well, she had different plans. She was giving Joe money so he can go and get violin lessons, but Joe instead took the money, brought it down to the Brewster Recreation Center where he was getting boxing lessons.
1932, Louis embarks on a stellar amateur boxing career in which he fights 54 times, winning 50 of the fights. A staggering 43 by knockout victory, and he became the Detroit Golden Gloves light heavyweight champion in the open class. Joe Louis was ready to turn pro. July 4th, 1934, Louis's first professional bout in Chicago, Louis knocks out his opponent in the first round. Over the next 5 months, he wins 11 bouts in a row, 9 of them by knockout.
At this point, he was fighting and beating some of the best heavyweights in the division. He looked unstoppable and was clearly on a path to a title shot. What he really needed, though, was a training facility to call home.
In 1935, Pompton Lakes, New Jersey had a history-changing moment in the world of boxing, and it started when Joe Louis decides to train in the borough at Dr. Joseph Bear's health farm.
Doc Beer's farm had already been the training facility since 1923 for many high-level professional boxers. In fact, there were no less than 10 former world champions that trained at the facility in the 14 years before Joe Louis arrived in Pompton Lakes.
But none of them grew to be loved by the community here like Joe Louis was eventually loved.
Pancho Villa,
Harry Greb,
Benny Leonard,
Tony Canzaneri,
Pete Latzo.
even Jackie Kid Burke.
They were all boxing champions who trained right here in Pompton Lakes, New Jersey at Doc Bear's farm before Joe Louis even arrived.
No other fighter that ever trained here in Pompton Lakes had ever truly formed the kind of bond that Joe Louis did with the local community.
He just really became somebody that cared very deeply for the community.
Joe Louis loved being able to give back to the community. He loved Pompton Lakes. That tower that we have in town, that tower exists because of funds that were raised from an exhibition fight. He fought so the town could have something.
I guess you can say he became a friendly, tolerable character himself.
Spring 1935. Louis is dismayed to learn that local resident and pedestrian Roger Vreeland is struck by a car and expires while waiting for an ambulance service from a neighboring town.
The community tried to raise funds to purchase an ambulance of their very own, which was desperately needed to help save future lives. Despite their best efforts, they came up short.
Joe Louis stepped in and offered to have an exhibition fight. That exhibition fight raised an additional $2,900, which was then donated, and those funds were used to buy the first ever ambulance for the borough of Pompton Lakes.
Ahead of Lewis's fight against German opponent Max Schmeling, his handlers decided to move him from Pompton Lakes to Lakewood to train for the fight, a move that he always regretted.
Joe Louis was winning his fights through 1936. And then, well, on a brief moment, he decided to train outside of Pompton Lakes. And in 1936, he lost to Max Schmeling.
Was it that he missed Pompton Lakes so much and training here that he didn't fight his best fight? Or was it that he decided to pick up golf at the same time when training for his fight with Schmeling?
That was it. Joe Louis was returning to Pompton Lakes because that's when he learned that Pompton Lakes was his lucky charm.
The 12-round knockout by Schmeling set off a chain of events that eventually led to one of the most heroic and defining championship title runs in the history of boxing, and the pitting of one nation against another.
He returned to train in Pompton Lakes again, and after several fights, earned a title shot against James Broderick in 1937 and defeated him in the third round to win the championship.
Even though he was the champion of the world, he was on a collision course with Schmeling once again in a rematch at Yankee Stadium. July 22nd, 1938, with the hopes of two nations pinned to the expectation of victory in the ring, the rematch between Germany's Max Schmeling and the United States' Joe Louis took place at a full-capacity Yankee Stadium. The result, however, was much different than the first time around. March 1st, 1949, Joe Louis retires from boxing as the undefeated heavyweight champion of the world after defending his title a record 25 times. In the interim, Joe had the opportunity to serve his country as a sergeant in the Army and fought 96 exhibitions for his fellow soldiers while serving. Joe came out of retirement several times in order to pay debts owed to the IRS. Financially speaking, he was mismanaged during his career by unscrupulous managers and never truly was able to enjoy the normal retirement reserved for those of his status and achievement. Louis fought his last fight on October 26, 1951 in New York against Rocky Marciano, who stopped him in 8 rounds to end one of the most remarkable careers in boxing history. April 12, 1981, Joe Louis, the improbable American hero and celebrated sports figure, passes away, but not before leaving an indelible mark on Pompton Lakes, New Jersey, and the rest of the world. Well, thanks for listening to Something Happened Here on Paul Bastante. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs a little local history with their morning coffee. See you next time on Something Happened Here.